I'm Maya, 29, and I thought I knew exactly what betrayal felt like until the moment my husband David shoved me down our staircase to test if my pregnancy was real, while my sister Chloe stood there laughing like it was the funniest joke she'd ever witnessed. What they didn't know was that their twisted experiment would trigger a chain of events that would expose years of lies, manipulation, and secrets that would tear apart everything they thought they controlled. The sound of my body hitting those stairs wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of the most devastating revenge story that would leave both of them begging for forgiveness they'd never receive. Before we dive into this shocking tale of family betrayal that'll make you question everyone you trust, I need to know, what do you think drove my own sister to participate in something so cruel? Drop your theories in the comments below. If stories about toxic marriages and sibling betrayal get your blood boiling, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this journey into the darkest corners of family dynamics is about to reveal truths that will leave you absolutely speechless. 2 years ago, I thought I was living the dream life that every woman envisions when she says I do. David Harrison was everything I'd been told to want in a husband: successful attorney at a prestigious firm, charming enough to make my friends envious, and wealthy enough to provide the kind of lifestyle that looked perfect on social media. Our wedding had been featured in the local society pages, our house was the envy of our neighborhood, and from the outside, we appeared to be the golden couple who had it all figured out. But behind closed doors, our marriage had been slowly rotting from the inside. David's charm, which had swept me off my feet during our whirlwind courtship, had gradually revealed itself to be a carefully constructed mask that hid a controlling, manipulative personality that demanded perfection in every aspect of our shared life. The man who had once listened to my dreams and ambitions with apparent fascination had systematically dismantled my confidence, my career aspirations, and my connections to friends and family who might have seen through his facade. The transformation had been so gradual that I hadn't recognized it as abuse until much later. It started with helpful suggestions about my appearance. Maybe I should try a different hairstyle, perhaps that dress was a bit too attention-seeking for a lawyer's wife. Wouldn't I look more professional in something more conservative? Then came the career sabotage disguised as concern. My job as a graphic designer was so stressful. Wouldn't I be happier focusing on supporting his career instead of dealing with demanding clients and impossible deadlines? By our first anniversary, I had quit my job, isolated myself from most of my friends, and convinced myself that being a devoted wife was more fulfilling than the creative career I'd spent years building. David provided everything I needed financially, so why did I feel so empty and disconnected from the person I used to be? The woman who had once been confident, creative, and independent had been replaced by someone who sought permission for the smallest decisions and apologized for existing too loudly in her own home. The most insidious part of David's control was how he made me complicit in my own isolation. When friends would call or text, he'd point out how exhausted I looked, how much I'd been complaining about work stress, how much happier I seemed when we had quiet evenings at home together. Gradually, I stopped making plans with people who might have noticed the changes in my personality and behavior. I stopped pursuing freelance design projects that might have reminded me of my capabilities and independence. My relationship with my family became another casualty of David's systematic isolation tactics. My parents, who lived across the country, received carefully crafted updates about our wonderful life together, complete with photos of expensive vacations and elegant dinner parties. They had no idea that I was increasingly unhappy, that I felt trapped in a life that looked perfect but felt suffocating, that their confident daughter was disappearing piece by piece. But the most devastating betrayal came from someone I never suspected, my younger sister Chloe. At 26, Chloe had always been the free spirit of our family. The one who changed careers every 2 years, dated musicians and artists, and seemed to live life according to her own rules rather than social expectations. I had envied her freedom and authenticity, especially as my own life became more constrained and artificial. When Chloe moved to our city 6 months ago, ostensibly to be closer to family and explore new opportunities, I was thrilled to have an ally, someone who knew the real me and could help me remember who I used to be. David had been surprisingly welcoming, encouraging me to spend time with my sister and even suggesting that she stay in our guest room while she looked for her own place. What I didn't realize was that David and Chloe had been having an affair that started within weeks of her arrival. The sister I trusted with my deepest insecurities, the husband I was trying so hard to please. They had been laughing at my naivety while carrying on a relationship that made a mockery of everything I believed about family loyalty and marriage vows. The signs had been there, but I'd been so conditioned to doubt my own perceptions that I dismissed every red flag as paranoia or insecurity. David's sudden interest in fitness, his new cologne, his longer hours at the office that were supposedly devoted to important cases. Chloe's secretive phone calls, her reluctance to discuss her job search, her knowing smirks when David would make condescending comments about my appearance or intelligence. They had been conducting their affair under my own roof, in my guest room, while I cooked dinners and planned family gatherings and tried to be the perfect wife and sister. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that when I finally discovered the truth, I questioned everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family bonds. The pregnancy that would ultimately expose their affair and trigger the most traumatic experience of my life had been unplanned but welcomed. After months of feeling disconnected from my own body and identity, the idea of creating new life felt like a chance to rediscover purpose and joy. David's reaction to the news had been lukewarm at best, supportive in public, but privately expressing concerns about timing, finances, and how a baby would affect his career trajectory. But it was Chloe's reaction that should have warned me about the depths of their deception. Instead of the excitement and support I expected from my sister, she had seemed almost angry about the pregnancy, making cruel comments about my readiness for motherhood and suggesting that I was trying to trap David with an unplanned baby. The woman who had once been my closest confidant was now questioning my motives and my capability in ways that felt designed to undermine my confidence and happiness. What I didn't know was that my pregnancy represented a threat to their affair, a complication that would make it harder for David to leave me for Chloe without looking like a complete monster. So they decided to find a way to make me lose the baby while making it look like an accident, a plan so evil and calculating that it would haunt me for years to come. The systematic campaign to make me doubt my own pregnancy began subtly, with comments and observations that seemed concerned but were actually designed to plant seeds of uncertainty in my mind. It started with Chloe's seemingly innocent questions about my symptoms. Was I really experiencing morning sickness every day, or was it just anxiety? Did I actually feel the fatigue that comes with pregnancy, or was I just imagining things because I wanted to be pregnant so badly? David joined the effort with what appeared to be loving concern about my mental state. He'd point out that I'd been under a lot of stress lately, that I'd been acting differently even before the pregnancy test, that maybe I should consider seeing a therapist to work through whatever issues were affecting my perception of reality. The man who had systematically isolated me from my support system was now suggesting that my isolation was evidence of mental instability. The most insidious part of their gaslighting was how they used my own pregnancy symptoms against me. When I'd rush to the bathroom with morning sickness, Chloe would follow with concerned questions about whether I might have a stomach bug or food poisoning instead. When I'd feel exhausted after a full day, David would suggest that my fatigue was psychosomatic, that I was so desperate to be pregnant that I was manifesting symptoms that weren't really there. They began questioning the reliability of home pregnancy tests, pointing out that false positives were more common than people realized, that stress and certain medications could cause misleading results. David, with his legal training, was particularly effective at presenting doubt as logic and concern as evidence. He'd research articles about phantom pregnancies, about women who convinced themselves they were pregnant when they weren't, about the psychological factors that could create convincing physical symptoms. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm worried about you," he'd say with practiced concern. "You've been under so much pressure lately, and I've read that stress can actually trigger the same hormones that pregnancy tests detect. Maybe we should wait a few more weeks before getting too excited, just to be sure." Chloe's contribution to the campaign was even more cruel because it came wrapped in sisterly concern. She'd share stories about friends who had experienced false positive tests, who had convinced themselves they were pregnant because they wanted babies so desperately. She'd suggest that my desire for pregnancy was affecting my judgment, that I was interpreting normal bodily functions as pregnancy symptoms because I needed something to give my life meaning. "I'm worried that you're setting yourself up for disappointment," she'd say, rubbing my back with fake sympathy. "You've been talking about wanting a baby for so long, and I just don't want to see you devastated if this turns out to be a false alarm." The psychological torture of having the two people closest to me constantly questioning my reality was devastating. I began to doubt every symptom, every sign, every instinct that told me I was carrying new life. When I'd feel nauseated in the morning, I'd wonder if it was really pregnancy or just anxiety about their doubts. When I'd feel tired in the afternoon, I'd question whether it was hormonal changes or just the emotional exhaustion of constantly defending my own perceptions. They encouraged me to delay seeing a doctor, suggesting that it was too early for accurate blood tests, that I should wait until I was further along to avoid the disappointment of inconclusive results. David even offered to research the best obstetricians in the area, a task that gave him control over the timeline and allowed him to delay scheduling appointments indefinitely. "Let's wait until you're at least 8 weeks along," he'd suggest. "That's when the pregnancy hormones are strongest, when the tests are most reliable. I don't want you to go through the stress of false results or inconclusive blood work." Meanwhile, Chloe would share horror stories about women who had rushed to doctors too early, who had received false reassurances that led to greater heartbreak when the pregnancies turned out to be non-viable. She painted early medical intervention as risky and premature, better to wait until there was no doubt about the pregnancy's viability. The isolation that David had previously imposed now served their gaslighting perfectly. I had no close friends to confide in, no family members nearby to offer outside perspective, no independent sources of information or support. The only voices I heard were theirs, constantly questioning my reality, suggesting that my desire for pregnancy was affecting my judgment, implying that I was either delusional or deliberately lying about symptoms I was clearly experiencing. They began suggesting that my behavior was concerning, that my insistence on being pregnant despite their reasonable doubts indicated deeper psychological issues. David would point out how defensive I became when they expressed concern, how irrational I seemed when presented with alternative explanations for my symptoms. He began keeping a mental catalog of my erratic behavior that he could reference whenever I pushed back against their narrative. "Maya, you're getting upset again," he'd say when I'd insist that my symptoms were real. "This kind of emotional volatility isn't like you. Maybe the stress of thinking you're pregnant is affecting your mental health more than we realized." The campaign reached its peak when they began suggesting that I might be faking the pregnancy consciously, that my desperation for a baby had led me to create an elaborate deception that I'd convinced myself was real. The accusation was so hurtful, so completely contrary to everything I knew about myself, that it shattered my confidence in ways I'm still recovering from. "I'm not saying you're lying intentionally," Chloe would say with practiced gentleness. "But sometimes when we want something so badly, we can convince ourselves it's true even when it isn't. Maybe you bought pregnancy tests and convinced yourself they showed positive results because that's what you needed to see." David's approach was more direct and cruel. "Maya, I love you, but I'm starting to think you're either delusional or manipulative. Either you genuinely believe you're pregnant despite evidence to the contrary, which means you need professional help, or you're consciously lying to me about this pregnancy, which means our marriage is built on deception." The psychological abuse was so complete that I began to question my own sanity. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I had convinced myself I was pregnant because I wanted it so desperately. Maybe the physical symptoms I was experiencing were psychosomatic, created by a mind that was more damaged than I realized. But deep down, beneath all their manipulation and gaslighting, I knew the truth. I was pregnant. My body was changing in ways that couldn't be faked or imagined. The morning sickness, the breast tenderness, the fatigue, the heightened sense of smell, these were real physical experiences that no amount of psychological manipulation could explain away. What I didn't understand was why the two people who claimed to love me most were so determined to convince me otherwise. I had no idea that their campaign to make me doubt my pregnancy was actually preparation for something far more sinister, a plan to end my pregnancy in a way that would look accidental while destroying my credibility and mental health in the process. The truth about David and Chloe's affair came to light in the most devastating way possible, through a series of discoveries that shattered not just my marriage but my faith in family bonds and my understanding of the people I'd trusted most. It started with small inconsistencies that I might have overlooked if their gaslighting campaign hadn't already made me hypervigilant about questioning reality and trusting my own perceptions. 3 weeks into their systematic campaign to convince me my pregnancy was fake, I began noticing things that didn't align with their carefully constructed narratives. David claimed to be working late at the office on cases that required extensive research, but when I called his law firm's main line to leave a message, the receptionist mentioned that most attorneys left by 6 p.m. and the building was usually empty by 8. Chloe was supposedly job hunting during the day, but when I asked about specific interviews or applications, her answers were vague and contradictory. The first concrete evidence came when I found a restaurant receipt in David's jacket pocket, not unusual in itself, except that it was for dinner for two at an upscale restaurant on a night when he'd claimed to be working late and I'd eaten dinner alone. The date and time stamp showed he'd been at this romantic restaurant during the exact hours he'd supposedly been reviewing case files for an important client meeting. When I confronted him about the receipt, his explanation was smooth and practiced. He'd taken an important client to dinner to discuss their case, a business expense that was perfectly normal for someone in his position. The fact that I was suspicious about a routine business dinner was further evidence of the paranoia and irrationality that had been concerning him lately. Was I going to start questioning every aspect of his professional life now? But the receipt bothered me because the restaurant was known for intimate dining, not business meetings. It specialized in romantic ambience and couples dining experiences, not the kind of place where serious legal discussions would typically take place. Something about David's explanation felt rehearsed, too polished, like he'd been prepared for this exact confrontation. My suspicions were confirmed when I decided to do something I'd never done before in our marriage. I looked through his phone while he was in the shower. The guilt of violating his privacy was overwhelming, but the need to understand why I felt so disconnected from reality was stronger than my respect for boundaries. What I found was worse than any affair I could have imagined. The text message thread between David and Chloe went back 4 months, starting with innocent exchanges about her job search and living arrangements, then gradually escalating into intimate conversations that revealed the depth of their betrayal. But the most devastating messages were the recent ones, where they discussed their plan to convince me that my pregnancy was either fake or psychosomatic. "She's getting more suspicious about the pregnancy thing," Chloe had written just 2 days earlier. "We need to step up the gaslighting before she decides to see a doctor." David's response was chillingly calculating: keep questioning her symptoms and suggesting psychological causes. "I've been researching phantom pregnancy syndrome, and we can use that to explain away any physical signs if she gets a medical exam." The conversation continued with detailed strategies for undermining my confidence and mental stability. They discussed which pregnancy symptoms to question, how to suggest alternative explanations for my physical experiences, and ways to delay medical confirmation while making it seem like concern for my well-being. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As I scrolled through their messages, I found a conversation from the previous week that made my blood run cold. "What if she actually is pregnant?" Chloe had asked. David's response was so casual, so devoid of any concern for my well-being, that I had to read it several times before I could believe what I was seeing. "Then we'll have to do something about it. Make it look like an accident. You know how clumsy she's been lately." The implication was unmistakable. They weren't just trying to convince me that my pregnancy was fake, they were planning to end it if their psychological manipulation failed. The man I'd married, the sister I'd trusted with my life, were actively conspiring to cause me to miscarry while making it appear accidental. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone as I continued reading. The messages revealed months of planning and deception that went far beyond a simple affair. They had discussed David divorcing me after I had a natural miscarriage, making it look like the loss had driven us apart rather than revealing their betrayal. Chloe would be there to comfort David through his grief, and eventually, they'd end up together without the scandal that would damage his reputation if their affair became public knowledge. The plan was diabolical in its completeness. They would destroy my pregnancy, my marriage, and my mental health while positioning themselves as the victims of my supposed instability and deception. David would emerge as the devoted husband who had tried to help his delusional wife, while Chloe would be the caring sister who had tried to support both of us through a difficult time. But what made the betrayal even more devastating was discovering that they had been intimate in my own home, in the guest room where I'd welcomed Chloe out of love and family loyalty. The messages included references to times when they'd been together while I was in the same house, cooking dinner or working on household tasks, completely unaware that my husband and sister were betraying me just rooms away. The emotional impact of reading those messages was so overwhelming that I had to run to the bathroom to vomit, not from morning sickness this time, but from the physical revulsion of discovering how completely I'd been deceived by the people I loved most. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my family, and my own judgment had been systematically destroyed in the span of 20 minutes. As I sat on the bathroom floor, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal, I realized that I was in genuine danger. These weren't just unfaithful partners who had gotten caught up in an affair, these were people who were planning to harm me and my unborn child to cover their tracks and avoid consequences for their choices. The pregnancy they'd been trying to convince me was fake was very real, and now I understood that their campaign to make me doubt it was preparation for something far more sinister. They were planning to cause me to lose the baby, then use my supposed mental instability as explanation for why I'd convinced myself I was pregnant in the first place. I had to leave immediately, but I also had to be smart about it. David's legal training and connections meant he could make my life very difficult if he suspected I knew about their plan. Chloe's knowledge of our family dynamics meant she could manipulate the situation to make me look like the unstable sister who had destroyed her own marriage through paranoia and false accusations. But first, I needed evidence. I took photographs of the most damaging text messages, forwarded key conversations to my own email account, and began gathering financial documents and personal items that I couldn't afford to lose. If I was going to survive what was coming, I needed to be prepared for a battle that would determine not just my future, but potentially my life. What I didn't anticipate was that they were planning to act much sooner than their messages had indicated. The next morning would bring the confrontation that would change everything, and I would learn just how far they were willing to go to protect their secret and eliminate the complication that my pregnancy represented. The morning that would forever change my life started like any other day in our house of lies and manipulation. David was getting ready for work with his usual attention to appearance and professional image, while Chloe sat at our kitchen counter drinking coffee and pretending to review job listings on her laptop. I was trying to eat breakfast despite the morning sickness that had become more pronounced over the past week, still processing the devastating text messages I'd discovered the night before. The knowledge of their affair and their plan to harm my pregnancy sat in my chest like a burning weight, making it hard to breathe normally or maintain the facade of normalcy that had kept me safe for so long. Every casual interaction felt loaded with danger now that I understood the depths of their deception and the lengths they were willing to go to protect their secret. I had spent the sleepless hours planning my escape, researching women's shelters and legal resources, trying to figure out how to safely leave a situation that had become genuinely life-threatening. But I hadn't anticipated that they would act so quickly, that the casual morning routine would explode into violence before I could implement any of my careful preparations. The confrontation began when David noticed that I seemed more withdrawn than usual, that my responses to his questions were shorter and less engaging than they had been even during our recent difficult period. His legal instincts, trained to detect deception and evasion, picked up on the change in my demeanor immediately. "Maya, you seem upset about something this morning," he said, his tone carrying that familiar mix of concern and accusation that I now recognized as manipulation. "Are you having doubts about the pregnancy again? I know we've been trying to help you work through your confusion, but maybe it's time to consider professional help." The suggestion that I needed professional help for confusion that they had deliberately created was so manipulative that I couldn't hide my reaction. For the first time in months, instead of defending myself or trying to prove my sanity, I felt anger rising in my chest, clear rage at being gaslit and manipulated by people who claimed to love me. "I'm not confused about anything, David," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "I'm pregnant, I've been pregnant for weeks, and all your attempts to convince me otherwise aren't going to change that reality." Chloe looked up from her laptop with that familiar expression of concerned sisterly worry that I now understood was completely fake. "Maya, honey, we're worried about you. You're getting so defensive about this pregnancy thing, and your behavior has been really concerning lately. Maybe David's right about getting some professional help." The coordinated nature of their response, the way they immediately supported each other's narrative while positioning me as the problem, was so practiced that I realized they'd been planning this confrontation. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of concern, this was a deliberate attempt to escalate their gaslighting campaign. "You're both liars," I said, the words coming out with more force than I'd intended. "I know what you've been doing, I know about your affair, and I know about your plan to make me lose this baby." The silence that followed was electric with tension and danger. David's practiced expression of concern disappeared immediately, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before in our marriage. Chloe's fake worry transformed into something that looked almost like excitement, as if she'd been waiting for this confrontation. "Maya, what are you talking about?" David asked, but his tone had shifted completely. Instead of the gentle concern he'd been performing, there was now a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. "What affair? What plan? You're starting to sound genuinely paranoid now." But I had seen his phone. I had read their messages. I knew exactly what they had been planning, and for the first time in months, I felt certain of my own reality instead of questioning every perception and instinct. "I read your text messages, David. I know you've been sleeping with my sister for months. I know you've been planning to make me lose this baby and make it look like an accident. I know everything." The moment I spoke those words, the entire atmosphere in the kitchen changed. David and Chloe exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd discovered, a wordless communication that spoke of months of shared secrets and coordinated deception. But instead of denial or shame, what I saw in their expressions was anger at being caught and calculation about how to manage the situation. "Maya, you're clearly having some kind of mental breakdown," Chloe said, standing up from the counter with movements that seemed suddenly threatening. "Going through David's phone, making up elaborate conspiracy theories, accusing your own family of trying to hurt you. This is exactly the kind of behavior that proves you need professional help. And frankly," David added, moving closer to where I stood near the staircase, "the fact that you're so convinced you're pregnant when you're clearly not is just more evidence of how disconnected from reality you've become. There's something about that moment that I'll remember forever." The way they moved toward me in perfect coordination, the way their expressions shifted from fake concern to something predatory, the way I suddenly understood that I was in immediate physical danger from the two people who were supposed to protect me most. What happens next in moments like these? When you realize that the people you trusted with your life have been planning to hurt you, when you understand that everything you believed about love and family has been a carefully constructed lie? I want to know, Have you ever had that moment when reality shifts so completely that you feel like you're living in a different world? Drop your thoughts in the comments because what happened next will make you understand why some betrayals change everything about how you see the people closest to you. And if this story of ultimate betrayal is hitting you as hard as it's hitting me to tell, make sure you hit that subscribe button because the next part reveals just how far these two were willing to go. You know what I think? David continued, his voice taking on the tone he used in courtrooms when he was building to his closing argument. I think you're so desperate to trap me with a fake pregnancy that you've convinced yourself it's real. And now that we're questioning your lies, you're getting violent and paranoid. I'm not violent or paranoid, I said, backing toward the staircase as they continued to advance. I'm pregnant, and you know I'm pregnant, and you're trying to make me lose this baby. Prove it, Chloe said with a smile that was purely cruel. If you're really pregnant, prove it. What do you mean, prove it? David's answer chilled me to the bone. If you're really pregnant, then a little fall down the stairs shouldn't hurt anything, right? I mean, if there's really a baby in there, it should be pretty well protected. The suggestion was so monstrous that I couldn't process it immediately. My own husband was suggesting that I should fall down the stairs to prove my pregnancy was real, while my sister stood there nodding like this was a reasonable request. You're both insane, I whispered, continuing to back away from them. You want me to fall down the stairs to prove I'm pregnant? Do you understand how psychotic that sounds? What's psychotic is lying about being pregnant to manipulate your husband, Chloe said. What's psychotic is going through his phone and making up stories about affairs and conspiracy theories. What's psychotic is refusing to take a simple pregnancy test because you know it'll prove you're lying. But I had taken pregnancy tests. Multiple tests. All positive. They knew this, but they were rewriting history to fit their narrative, creating a version of reality where I was the delusional one who had been refusing medical confirmation of my condition. I have taken pregnancy tests, I said. They were all positive. Were they? David asked with that courtroom lawyer tone. Or did you just tell us they were positive because that's what you wanted them to say? The gaslighting had reached such an extreme level that they were now claiming I had lied about the test results themselves. But I understood now that this wasn't about convincing me I wasn't pregnant, this was about creating justification for what they were about to do. If you won't prove your pregnancy voluntarily, David said, stepping closer to where I stood at the top of the stairs, then maybe we need to help you face reality. What happened next occurred so quickly that I barely had time to process it. David's hands were suddenly on my shoulders, pushing with enough force to send me stumbling backward toward the stairs. I grabbed for the banister, trying to maintain my balance, but Chloe was there too, her hands shoving me from the side. The sound of Chloe's laughter as I fell down our staircase will haunt me for the rest of my life. Not shocked gasps or expressions of horror at an accidental fall, but actual laughter, as if watching her pregnant sister tumble down a flight of stairs was the most entertaining thing she'd ever witnessed. The physical pain of hitting the stairs was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of understanding that my husband and sister had just deliberately tried to kill my baby while making it look like an accident caused by my own instability. As I lay at the bottom of the stairs, fighting to stay conscious and desperately hoping that the cramping in my abdomen didn't mean I was losing the pregnancy they had tried so hard to convince me didn't exist, I could hear them already beginning to construct their story about my fall. She was acting so erratic, David was saying. Getting paranoid about imaginary affairs, claiming to be pregnant when she clearly wasn't, threatening us with violence. I think she fell because she was so worked up and delusional. I tried to help her, Chloe added. But she was backing away from us like we were trying to hurt her, and she lost her balance. It's so sad that her mental health has deteriorated this much. Even as they called 911, ostensibly to help me, they were laying the groundwork for a narrative that would make my accidental fall the result of my own mental instability rather than their deliberate violence. The pregnancy they had spent weeks trying to convince me was fake would now become the delusion that caused me to fall down the stairs in a moment of psychological crisis. But what they didn't know was that I had taken precautions the night before, after reading their text messages. I had hidden a recording device in the kitchen, hoping to capture evidence of their affair for potential divorce proceedings. Instead, I had recorded the entire attack. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of pain, fear, and desperate hope that my baby had survived the deliberate attack disguised as concern for my mental health. The EMTs were professional and reassuring, but I could see the concern in their eyes as they monitored my vital signs and documented the injuries from my fall down the stairs. What they couldn't see was the emotional trauma of being pushed by the two people I trusted most in the world. David and Chloe had followed the ambulance to the hospital, playing their roles as the concerned husband and sister dealing with a family crisis. I watched them through waves of pain and medication as they spoke with doctors and nurses, their expressions perfectly crafted to convey worry and confusion about my erratic behavior and psychological breakdown that had led to my fall. "She's been having delusions about being pregnant," I heard David tell the emergency room physician. "We've been trying to get her help, but she's been refusing medical evaluation. Today she became paranoid and aggressive, claiming we were trying to hurt her, and she fell while backing away from us." Chloe nodded along with his narrative, adding details that painted me as unstable and potentially dangerous to myself. "She's been acting so strange lately, going through David's phone, making up stories about affairs, insisting she's pregnant even though she won't take proper tests. We're really worried about her mental state." But what they didn't anticipate was that hospital protocols for domestic violence situations are much more sophisticated than they realized. When someone arrives at the emergency room with injuries that could be consistent with being pushed or shoved, medical staff are trained to look for signs that the official story might not be complete. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency room physician who treated me, had seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the patterns. The injuries from my fall, bruising on my shoulders consistent with hand grips, the angle of impact with the stairs, the way David and Chloe seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than with my well-being, all raised red flags that prompted her to request a private conversation with me. "Maya, I need to ask you some questions about what happened today," Dr. Chen said after David and Chloe had been asked to wait in the family area. "Your injuries are consistent with a fall downstairs, but there are some aspects of your situation that concern me. I want you to know that anything you tell me will be kept confidential unless you give me permission to share it." The relief of finally having someone listen to me without immediately dismissing my concerns as mental illness was overwhelming. For weeks, every person in my life had been telling me to doubt my own perceptions and experiences. Dr. Chen was the first person who seemed interested in hearing my version of events without prejudice. "They pushed me," I whispered, still afraid that somehow David and Chloe would hear me and find a way to punish me for telling the truth. "My husband and my sister. They've been having an affair, and they pushed me down the stairs because they wanted me to lose my baby." Dr. Chen's expression remained calm and professional, but I could see the concern deepen in her eyes. "Maya, are you saying that your fall wasn't accidental? That someone deliberately pushed you?" The validation of being believed, of having someone take my account seriously instead of immediately attributing it to mental illness, was so powerful that I started crying for the first time since the attack. "Yes. They've been trying to convince me that my pregnancy is fake, that I'm delusional, but I know I'm pregnant. They said if I was really pregnant, falling down the stairs shouldn't hurt the baby, and then they pushed me." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, processing information that aligned with her clinical observations. "Maya, I need to tell you something important. We ran a pregnancy test as part of your emergency evaluation, and it came back positive. You are definitely pregnant, and based on your hormone levels, you've been pregnant for approximately 8 weeks. The confirmation of what I'd known all along, what David and Chloe had spent weeks trying to convince me was a delusion, was simultaneously validating and terrifying. I was pregnant, my baby had survived their attack, but now I had medical proof that their gaslighting campaign had been deliberately constructed to make me doubt a reality they knew was true. The good news is that the fetal heartbeat is strong and regular, Dr. Chen continued. Your baby appears to have survived the fall without apparent harm, though we'll want to monitor you closely over the next few days. But Maya, if what you're telling me is true, if your husband and sister deliberately pushed you down the stairs, then you and your baby are in serious danger. Dr. Chen explained that she was required to report suspected domestic violence to the authorities, and that the hospital had protocols in place to help protect patients who were being abused by family members. She also mentioned that my injuries and the circumstances of my fall would be thoroughly documented in case law enforcement needed evidence for potential charges. I have something that might help, I told her, remembering the recording device I'd hidden in the kitchen the night before. I recorded the conversation before they pushed me. I have evidence of what they did. The relief on Dr. Chen's face was obvious. Maya, that's incredibly important evidence. I'm going to contact our patient advocate and social services, and they'll help you figure out how to safely preserve that recording and get it to the appropriate authorities. While Dr. Chen was making calls and arranging for additional support, I was moved to a private room where I could rest and be monitored without David and Chloe having access to me. The peace of being away from their manipulation and gaslighting was almost as healing as the medical treatment I was receiving. But the most important conversation came when Detective James Rodriguez arrived to take my statement about the incident. Unlike David and Chloe's narrative about my mental instability, Detective Rodriguez was trained to investigate domestic violence cases and understood the patterns of abuse that often preceded physical attacks. Mrs. Harrison, I want you to walk me through everything that happened today, starting from when you woke up this morning, he said, settling into the chair beside my hospital bed with a notepad and recording device. Take your time and don't worry about what anyone else has said about the situation. I want to hear your version of events. The process of telling the complete story, the affair, the gaslighting campaign, the discovery of their text messages, and the deliberate attack, took over an hour. Detective Rodriguez listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions that helped me provide specific details about timing, locations, and the exact words that David and Chloe had used during their manipulation. Mrs. Harrison, you mentioned that you have a recording of the incident. That would be extremely valuable evidence if you're willing to provide it to our investigation. I gave Detective Rodriguez detailed instructions about where to find the recording device in my kitchen, along with permission to search my home for additional evidence of David and Chloe's affair and their planning to harm my pregnancy. The text messages I'd photographed the night before would also be crucial evidence of premeditation. Based on what you've told me and the medical evidence of your injuries, I have probable cause to arrest both your husband and sister for assault and attempted murder, Detective Rodriguez explained. The fact that you're pregnant makes this an even more serious crime, as they were potentially trying to harm not just you but your unborn child. The words attempted murder made the reality of my situation sink in completely. This wasn't just about an affair or a marriage gone wrong. David and Chloe had literally tried to kill me and my baby, then planned to use my supposed mental illness to explain away their crime. Within hours of Detective Rodriguez's visit, David and Chloe were arrested at the hospital where they'd been maintaining their vigil as concerned family members. The recording of their attack, combined with the text messages planning to harm my pregnancy, provided clear evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when the arrest warrant was served. David, who had spent our entire marriage controlling every aspect of my life through legal manipulation and psychological abuse, was suddenly the one facing criminal charges. Chloe, who had participated in months of systematic gaslighting while betraying our family bond, was being led away in handcuffs. The hospital social worker, Lisa Martinez, helped me understand my options for safety and legal protection. Maya, you're going to need a restraining order against both of them, and you'll need a safe place to stay while the criminal case proceeds. Do you have family or friends who can help support you during this process? The isolation that David had imposed during our marriage suddenly became a serious practical problem. I had no close friends nearby, no family members who could immediately help me navigate this crisis. But Lisa Martinez explained that there were resources available for domestic violence survivors, including emergency housing and legal advocacy services. The most important thing right now is keeping you and your baby safe, she said. Everything else, the divorce proceedings, the financial arrangements, the criminal trial, can be handled once you're in a secure situation. The next few days in the hospital became a crash course in rebuilding my life and identity after years of systematic abuse and manipulation. I had to relearn how to trust my own perceptions, how to make decisions without seeking approval from someone who had been controlling my thoughts and actions, how to advocate for myself and my unborn child. The pregnancy that David and Chloe had tried so hard to eliminate became the source of my strength and motivation. Every kick, every movement, every medical confirmation of my baby's health was proof that their attack had failed, that life and love were stronger than their hatred and selfishness. But the most important realization came when I understood that their betrayal, while devastating, had also freed me from a life of deception and control. For the first time in years, I could make decisions based on my own values and desires rather than trying to meet impossible standards set by people who never truly loved me. The recording that would eventually convict them both had captured not just evidence of their crime, but proof that I had been telling the truth all along. My pregnancy was real, their affair was real, and their plan to harm me was real. Everything I'd been gaslit into doubting was validated by evidence that no amount of manipulation could explain away. As I prepared to leave the hospital and begin the process of rebuilding my life, I realized that surviving their attack was just the beginning. The real victory would come from creating a life for myself and my child that was built on truth, safety, and genuine love, everything that my marriage to David had lacked. The weeks following David and Chloe's arrest became a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and shocking revelations that exposed the true depth of their deception and planning. What had initially appeared to be a crime of passion, an affair that escalated into violence, was revealed through investigation to be a much more calculated and long-term conspiracy that had been in motion for months. The recording I had captured of their attack became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, but it was far from the only evidence that emerged during the investigation. When police searched our home with a warrant, they discovered a laptop that David had thought was secure, containing months of detailed planning for what they called Project Maya, a systematic campaign to drive me to mental breakdown while positioning themselves to inherit my assets and start a new life together. Detective Rodriguez shared some of the findings during one of our meetings to prepare for trial testimony. Mrs. Harrison, what they were doing to you goes far beyond a simple affair. This was identity theft, financial fraud, psychological abuse, and planned assault. They had researched everything from how to induce miscarriages to how to have someone committed for mental health treatment against their will. The financial investigation revealed that David had been systematically stealing from our joint accounts and redirecting funds to investments and accounts that only he could access. He had also forged my signature on several legal documents, including a life insurance policy that would have made him the sole beneficiary of a substantial payout if something happened to me during my pregnancy. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline that Chloe had kept on her personal laptop, documenting my behavior, reactions to their gaslighting, and plans for escalating their psychological manipulation. She had been studying my responses like a scientist conducting an experiment, noting which tactics were most effective at making me doubt my own reality. Day 23, Maya questioned her morning sickness again today after I suggested it might be anxiety. She's becoming more isolated and dependent on our version of reality. David thinks we can convince her to check herself into a psychiatric facility voluntarily within another month. Day 31, she found David's dinner receipt but accepted his explanation about a business client. Her ability to trust her own instincts is almost completely compromised. We need to accelerate the timeline before she decides to see a doctor independently. Day 45, Maya seems more suspicious lately. We may need to move to the physical intervention phase sooner than planned. David has researched accidental methods that would look like self-harm or clumsiness. Reading Chloe's clinical documentation of my psychological destruction was almost more devastating than the physical attack itself. My own sister had been treating my mental breakdown as a fascinating project, documenting my pain and confusion with the detachment of someone studying lab specimens. The media attention surrounding their arrest was intense and initially difficult to navigate. Local news outlets covered the story as a shocking case of domestic violence and family betrayal, but some of the early reporting focused more on the sensational aspects than on the serious crimes they had committed. However, my attorney, Patricia Williams, helped me understand how to use the media attention to ensure that the full truth came out rather than allowing David and Chloe to control the narrative from jail. Maya, they're going to try to maintain their story that you were mentally unstable and that your fall was accidental. We need to make sure the public understands the evidence of premeditation and the systematic nature of their abuse. The preliminary hearing was my first opportunity to see David and Chloe since their arrest, and the experience was both empowering and emotionally difficult. They sat at the defense table looking deflated and defeated, a stark contrast to the confident manipulators who had controlled my life for so many months. David's expensive suit and practiced courtroom demeanor couldn't hide the fact that he was now the defendant rather than the successful attorney he'd always portrayed himself to be. His law firm had suspended him pending the outcome of the criminal trial, and several of his high-profile clients had already sought new representation to avoid association with the scandal. Chloe looked even more diminished, her usual free-spirited confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed persona had been completely exposed. The sister who had positioned herself as my protector and advocate was revealed to be my most dangerous enemy. But the most satisfying moment came during the reading of charges. As the prosecutor detailed each count, attempted murder, assault with intent to harm a fetus, conspiracy, financial fraud, identity theft, I watched David and Chloe realize that their actions were being treated as serious felonies rather than the family dispute they had tried to portray. The defendants engaged in a months-long conspiracy to psychologically abuse the victim, steal her assets, and ultimately cause her to miscarry through deliberate physical violence, the prosecutor stated. This was not a crime of passion or a domestic dispute, this was calculated attempted murder designed to look accidental. Their defense attorneys attempted to maintain the narrative that I had been mentally unstable and that my fall had been accidental, but the physical evidence contradicted their claims at every turn. The recording of their attack included clear statements about testing my pregnancy by pushing me down the stairs, and the text messages revealed months of planning to harm me if their psychological manipulation failed. During my testimony, I was finally able to tell the complete truth about our marriage, their affair, and the systematic campaign to destroy my mental health and physical safety. Speaking publicly about the abuse was terrifying but also liberating. For the first time, I could describe my experiences without being told I was delusional or paranoid. Mrs. Harrison, can you describe the gaslighting campaign that the defendants used against you? My attorney asked. They spent weeks trying to convince me that my pregnancy was either fake or psychosomatic, I explained to the court. Every symptom I experienced was questioned, every instinct I had was dismissed as mental illness. They delayed medical confirmation while researching ways to make me doubt my own reality. When their psychological manipulation didn't work, they decided to physically attack me while making it look accidental. The defense attorneys tried to characterize my testimony as the confused recollections of someone who had experienced a psychological breakdown, but the documentary evidence made their arguments impossible to sustain. The recordings, text messages, and physical evidence told a story that was consistent and verifiable. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Dr. Chen testified about my medical treatment and the clear signs of deliberate violence rather than accidental injury. Her professional assessment that my injuries were consistent with being pushed rather than falling accidentally destroyed any remaining credibility in David and Chloe's version of events. The patient's injuries, her account of events, and the physical evidence all supported a conclusion of deliberate assault rather than accidental trauma, Dr. Chen told the court. Furthermore, her pregnancy was medically confirmed at approximately 8 weeks gestation, directly contradicting claims that she was delusional about her condition. As the trial progressed, additional victims came forward with stories of David's manipulative behavior in previous relationships. 2 former girlfriends testified about similar patterns of psychological abuse, isolation from support systems, and financial manipulation that had characterized their relationships with him. The pattern evidence showed that David's abuse of me wasn't an isolated incident but part of a systematic approach to controlling and exploiting romantic partners. Chloe's participation had made their campaign against me more effective, but the fundamental pattern of behavior was consistent with his previous relationships. By the time closing arguments began, the defense had essentially abandoned their claims about my mental instability and were instead arguing for reduced charges based on claims that David and Chloe had never intended to seriously harm me or my baby. But the prosecution's closing argument was devastating. The defendants spent months planning to destroy Maya Harrison's pregnancy, her marriage, her mental health, and potentially her life. They documented their planning, celebrated their success in manipulating her, and ultimately attempted to murder her and her unborn child when their psychological torture wasn't sufficient. This was not a family dispute, this was attempted murder. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. David was convicted of attempted murder, assault with intent to harm a fetus, conspiracy, and multiple financial crimes. Chloe was convicted of attempted murder, conspiracy, and accessory charges related to the financial fraud. But the most meaningful moment came during victim impact statements, when I was finally able to address them directly about how their actions had affected my life and my unborn child's future. "You didn't just betray our marriage and our family relationship," I told them, my voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "You tried to convince me that I was insane for believing my own experiences. You tried to murder my baby to cover up your affair. You destroyed my ability to trust my own perceptions and made me question my sanity for months. But you failed. My baby survived your attack, I survived your manipulation, and now everyone knows the truth about who you really are." 6 months later, I'm sitting in the nursery of my new apartment, writing this story while my 3-month-old daughter Emma sleeps peacefully in her crib, completely unaware that her very existence represents the ultimate victory over people who tried to prevent her from being born. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminates a room filled with love, hope, and the kind of safety that I didn't think was possible during the darkest days of my marriage to David. The sentencing hearing was the final chapter of a legal battle that had consumed my life for months but had ultimately delivered justice in ways that exceeded my hopes for accountability. David was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, with additional concurrent sentences for the conspiracy, financial fraud, and domestic violence charges. The judge specifically noted that the premeditated nature of their attack, combined with the systematic psychological abuse that preceded it, warranted the maximum penalty allowed under law. Chloe received a sentence of 12 years, with the judge commenting that her betrayal of family trust and her active participation in months of psychological torture made her equally culpable in the attempted murder despite not being the primary physical aggressor. Her detailed documentation of my psychological deterioration was cited as evidence of the calculated nature of their conspiracy. The defendants engaged in a sustained campaign of psychological torture designed to drive the victim to mental breakdown, Judge Patricia Martinez said during sentencing. When their gaslighting failed to achieve their desired result, they escalated to physical violence that could easily have resulted in the death of both the victim and her unborn child. This court finds their actions to be among the most callous and calculated crimes of domestic violence that I have encountered in 20 years on the bench. But beyond the legal victory, the real triumph has been in rebuilding my life and identity after years of systematic manipulation and control. The woman who had been convinced she was delusional and paranoid has discovered reserves of strength, intelligence, and resilience that David's abuse had hidden but never destroyed. The financial recovery took months of legal work, but eventually I was able to reclaim the assets that David had stolen and redirected during our marriage. The life insurance policy he had fraudulently taken out in my name became the foundation for a college fund for Emma, a twisted form of poetic justice that transformed his murder plot into security for the child he had tried to kill. More importantly, I've rebuilt relationships with family and friends that David's isolation tactics had damaged. My parents, who live across the country and had been receiving carefully crafted updates about our wonderful marriage, were horrified to learn about the abuse I had endured while pretending everything was perfect. Their support during the trial and recovery has been crucial in helping me trust again. "Maya, we should have seen the signs," my mother said during one of her extended visits to help with Emma. "The way you seemed more withdrawn during phone calls, how you stopped talking about your own interests and goals, how every conversation became about David's career and accomplishments. We thought you were happy being a supportive wife, but we should have recognized that you were losing yourself." The relationship with my parents has deepened in ways that wouldn't have been possible before the crisis forced us to communicate honestly about difficult topics. They've become not just grandparents to Emma, but genuine allies in creating the kind of family environment that prioritizes truth, support, and individual growth over appearances and social expectations. The career I had abandoned to become the perfect wife has been rebuilt from scratch, but with a perspective and purpose that my previous work had lacked. My graphic design business now specializes in creating materials for domestic violence organizations, legal advocacy groups, and women's shelters, using my creative skills to help other survivors tell their stories and access resources. "Maya, your work has been transformational for our organization," Dr. Sarah Williams, director of the local women's shelter, told me recently. "Having someone who understands the experience of domestic violence create our materials means that survivors see themselves reflected in our messaging in ways that traditional marketing never achieved." The speaking engagements that initially terrified me have become opportunities to help other women recognize the signs of psychological abuse and gaslighting before the situation escalates to physical violence. My story resonates with audiences because it demonstrates how abuse can happen to anyone, regardless of education, social status, or intelligence. "The most important thing I learned," I tell audiences, "is that gaslighting works by making you doubt your own perceptions and experiences. When someone systematically questions your reality, especially someone you love and trust, it becomes almost impossible to trust your own instincts. But those instincts are usually right, and learning to trust them again is crucial for both survival and recovery." Emma's birth was the most powerful affirmation that life and love are stronger than hatred and violence. The pregnancy that David and Chloe had tried to convince me was fake, then tried to end through violence, resulted in a healthy, beautiful daughter who represents everything they tried to destroy. Holding her for the first time, I understood that their attack had failed completely. Not only had they not succeeded in harming her, but their crimes had ultimately led to David losing everything he valued, his career, his freedom, his reputation, while I gained everything that truly matters: safety, truth, and the ability to raise my daughter without fear or manipulation. The most unexpected development has been finding love again, though in a very different way than I had ever imagined. Michael, the victim advocate who helped me navigate the legal system during the trial, has become someone who understands my journey without trying to fix or control me. Our relationship is built on honesty, respect, and mutual support rather than the performance and manipulation that characterized my marriage to David. "What I love about you," Michael told me recently, "is how you've transformed your trauma into strength without letting it define your entire identity. You're not just a survivor, you're someone who has built something beautiful from the pieces of a life that was almost destroyed." But perhaps the most meaningful transformation has been internal. The woman who spent years questioning her own sanity, who was convinced she was paranoid and delusional, has discovered that her instincts and perceptions were not only accurate but were trying to protect her from genuine danger. The recording device I hid in the kitchen, the photographs I took of their text messages, the decision to confide in Dr. Chen despite months of being told I was mentally unstable. All of these actions that David and Chloe characterized as evidence of my paranoia were actually evidence of my survival instincts working correctly. So here's my question for everyone who has followed this entire journey of betrayal, survival, and justice: have you ever had to choose between trusting others and trusting yourself? When the people closest to you were telling you one version of reality, but your instincts were screaming that something was wrong? The most important lesson I learned is that our intuition is often the first defense against people who want to harm us, especially when, those people claim to love us. If this story of surviving family betrayal and domestic violence has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding strength in impossible situations. Share this with anyone who might be questioning their own reality in a relationship where they're constantly being told they're wrong, paranoid, or mentally unstable. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is validate someone else's perceptions when they're being systematically gaslit. Tell me in the comments about a time when trusting your instincts saved you from a dangerous situation, even when other people were telling you to ignore your concerns. What red flags did you notice that others missed or dismissed? Your stories might help someone else recognize warning signs in their own relationships. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but ultimately hopeful journey from victim to survivor to someone who has rebuilt her life on foundations of truth, safety, and genuine love. Remember, if someone is trying to convince you that you're crazy for trusting your own experiences, that's usually evidence that your experiences are revealing something they don't want you to understand. Trust yourself, document everything, and never let anyone convince you that seeking help makes you weak or paranoid. Here's to families built on love rather than manipulation, to relationships based on truth rather than control, and to the incredible strength that emerges when we refuse to let other people's violence define our futures. Emma and I are living proof that sometimes the most beautiful victories come from surviving the most devastating betrayals, and that justice, real justice, means not just punishment for perpetrators, but freedom and healing for survivors. Life has taught me that the people who try to convince you that you're losing your mind are often the ones who are most afraid of what you might discover when you trust your own perceptions. The question isn't whether you're strong enough to survive their manipulation, it's whether you're brave enough to believe in yourself when everyone else is telling you not to.